Okay, so welcome everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to the 7th annual KT conference, which is hosted by the School of Agriculture and Food Science, UCD in Teagasc, and the conference is called the Innovation in Agriculture and Education and Extension, Looking Forward. So my name is Marion Beecher, and I'm a researcher working with Teagasc in the area of workload efficiency and productivity, and I'm the chair for this session, which is Labour, Human and Animal Welfare on Farms, and I'm joined co-chair with this session, which is Dr. Tomás Russell from UCD. So the extraordinary circumstances has meant that this normal one-day conference, which is normally held face-to-face, has turned into a 2-day webinar event. And just to make yourself familiar, there's 6 sessions which will be held over the 2 days. And each will be led by a chairperson and a co-chair, and which will include pre-recorded presentations followed by a live panel discussion. So there's a separate link for each of the sessions, and these are available on the conference programme. And it's important to notice both that all sessions are recorded and they'll be available on the School of Agriculture and Food Science YouTube channel and Ag Food at UCD Ag Food in the coming days. And for those of you who are active on social media, please tag at UCD Ag Food and at Teagasc and use the hashtag KTConf2020. So back to the current session. So it's not often, I suppose, that people link workload, animal welfare and people together, but I suppose there are areas that are intrinsically linked, and as you'll see that from the presentations. And I think one quote that sums it up well is that if you look after people, they'll look after the animals and everything else will follow. And I think today's 6 presentations that we have will give us an insight into best how to achieve that. So today's presenters at various stages of their careers in their research. So 2 have recently completed their master's projects, 2 are midway through, and we also have 2 PhD students who are in the middle of their projects. So after the presentations, the presenters will join us for a live panel discussion, and I invite all of you watching to get involved by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And please note that the chat function is disabled for today's session. So I'll now pass you over to my co-chair for the session, Dr. Tomás Russell from UCD, who's going to play the presentations.
Is by Eamon O'Flaherty, and his study looked at a qualitative approach to developing guidelines for employment of dry stock farmers on dairy farms.
My name is Eamon O'Flaherty, and the title of my study was A Qualitative Approach to the Development of Guidelines for the Employment of Dry Stock Farmers on Dairy Farms. So the rationale from this study came from 2 areas. Firstly, the dairy sector, which has seen rapid expansion post-quotas. This has created a skilled labour shortage within the industry, but it has also created new both full-time and part-time employment opportunities within the sector. Secondly, the dry stock industry, with many dry stock farmers across the country already employed off-farm due to low income per hectare and a relatively small scale of their operations. There was potential within this study which could benefit both sides due to the crossover skills associated with dairy and dry stock farming and the relative close proximity of dry stock and dairy farms across the country. So there was 4 objectives within this study. Firstly, to identify the barriers associated with dairy farm employment as a suitable form of income supplementation. Secondly, to examine how dairy farms can become more attractive workplaces for dry stock farmers who are currently employed off farm. Thirdly, examine how part-time work scenarios on dairy farms and how they can benefit both the employer and the employee. And finally, develop a clear set of guidelines for employment scenarios on dairy farms through the active collaboration of both dry stock and dairy farmers. So the first phase of the project involved identifying the teams associated with the barriers towards dairy farm employment. So the teams identified during phase 1 were used to determine how dairy farms can become more attractive workplaces. Firstly, by identifying current scenarios on dairy farms and how they worked for both the dairy farmer and employee. And secondly, examine what prospective employees look for in a job opportunity on a farm. So the main recurring themes or barriers identified towards dairy farm employment as a suitable form of income supplementation included farmers' perceptions and attitudes, the seasonality of dairy farm work, the working conditions and the manual labour associated with dairy farm employment, and the relative salary levels. Moving on to success factors identified from current employment arrangements on dairy farms included a flexible approach, close proximity, having regular working hours, having standard operating procedures in place, and starting small and growing over time as the relationship develops between both the employer and the employee. So some of the quotes pulled from the findings firstly indicate the issues many dairy farmers face in competing with similar sectors such as construction for labour. Secondly, the importance of having good facilities which eliminate the drudgery from tasks and the importance this has on attracting employees. And finally, with many dairy farmers only needing additional help over a 10 to 12 week window in the spring, this has a negative impact on potential employees' perceptions towards job security within dairy farm roles. So in order for working arrangements between both dairy farmers and dry stock farmers to be successful, firstly, close proximity is important so that the employee can tend to their own herd when necessary. Secondly, increasing the workload over time so you don't rush into too much too quickly. And finally, dairy farmers can attract prospective employees by providing regular working hours, training, both formal and informal, such as discussion groups, and having set start and end times to the day. So finally, in conclusion, issues regarding salaries, farmers' attitudes and working conditions were recognised as the main recurring themes or barriers towards dairy farm employment. However, where part-time employment scenarios were found to have been implemented successfully on dairy farms, the research suggests this allowed dairy farmers to focus on more management tasks, and it also offered the employees a reliable source of income without taking up too much of their time. Finally, dry stock farmers identified a lack of information in relation to dairy farm employment opportunities within their local areas, so it is hoped that the guidelines produced as part of this thesis will begin to fill the gap in information regarding this issue. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Eamon. Our second presentation is looking at supporting farmers in HR management, and this study was done by Niamh Brennan.
My name is Niamh Brennan, and this presentation is an overview of my thesis findings titled Farmers' Attitudes Towards Employment Law. I became interested in this topic because of my current role in the IFA. As part of this role, I am involved in the development of a service to help farmers become and remain compliant in employment law legislation. As part of this, I wanted to get a feel of farmers' current understanding and attitudes of employment requirements. Some of the background on this topic is that the number of people gaining employment in agriculture has risen in recent years and shows no sign of stagnation. Irish agriculture and forestry employ over 4,000 full-time workers and a further 15,000 seasonal workers. Almost half of Irish farms have a worker in place, whether it be a family member or non-family worker. There are over 60 pieces of employment legislation and regulation, all of which must be adhered to for compliance with employment law. The research objectives of this study were firstly to assess farmers' knowledge of employment law on farms, secondly to assess current farmer attitudes towards compliance on farms, and thirdly to determine if farmers are interested and will be willing to pay for a service to help them comply with employment law legislation. My research was based on both qualitative and quantitative analysis. I used a mixed method survey and a key informant interview. My sampling strategy for my survey was that participants must be IFA members, have between 1 and 5 full-time employees, and that they were the owner or manager of the business in question. 67 farmers were pre-selected. 42 responses were obtained, which equalled a response rate of 65%. Surveys were sent via email to members of the Horticulture, Pigs and Poultry, Dairy and Livestock Committee members. The key informant interview was conducted with Director of Ford HR, Jerome Ford. I will now outline some key results and findings from my study. From my analysis, it is clear that farmers value the importance of HR management. We see below that 98% of respondents either agreed or strongly agreed that having HR management is very important to their businesses. When I investigated where farmers currently source their HR expertise, on the right-hand side in the chart, we see that 78% of respondents source their information from their accountant, and only 28% source their information for HR specialists. We see that accountants, Teagasc and IFA all feature quite strongly from the results. And it's very interesting to see that the HR specialists only featured in 28%. Looking at the provision of a HR service for farmers, we see that only 8% of respondents currently employ a HR agency for their HR management. On a more positive note, when participants were asked if they'd be willing to pay for a service, we see that 63% agreed that they would be willing to pay for a service. When we look at how confident farmers are with employment law, which means that if they have the necessary knowledge, documents and practices and procedures in place, we see that most farmers are not unduly stressed at this stage. We see that only 10% of farmers were very confident that they understood the requirements. Nearly over half, 56% of farmers were moderately confident, and then we see that only 7% were either anxious or very anxious. We kind of expected this to be a bit higher, but maybe it's just due to lack of education in the area. To conclude then, it just say that at present farmers tend to have a reactive approach to employment law issues on farms, and they source their information mainly from agri-accountants and solicitors. Professional HR management services only feature in a small percentage of farms. In relation to farmer attitudes, the overall picture at this time suggests that farmers are not unduly stressed, but there is an appetite for a proposed service. Farmers may not be aware of the implications of non-compliance, and there is a need for education on this topic. And we see that willingness to pay for a service may be correlated to the level of awareness of the implications of non-compliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niamh. Our third presentation is by Tom Lawton, and his study looks at understanding the state of HR management on farms.
Hi everyone, my name is Thomas Lawton. I'm a Walsh Scholar based in Teagasc Moorpark. My presentation today is on understanding the state of human resource management on Irish dairy farms. So to give some background and context to this presentation, across the world the agricultural workforce has decreased, and according to the OECD it's going to continue to decrease. And research has shown us as well that the recruitment and management of people are two of the most problematic areas that farmers face. From an Irish perspective, in 2015 we saw the removal of EU milk quotas, and that provided farmers with an opportunity to expand their dairy enterprises. And what we've seen is an increase in milk production and in turn an increase in herd sizes. So taking into account that there's obviously a greater number of cows in Ireland and there's less people to do the work, my study was to try and establish, well, what are farmers actually doing in terms of their human resource management on their farms, and to also try and develop a profile of the dairy farmer as an employer. So how did I do this? In 2017, Dairy Australia produced a survey, and what I did was I remodeled that survey and adapted it towards the Irish industry. And then I selected my farmers at random based on herd size and location from Herd Plus. I posted out a survey pack to them, and that provided farmers then with an opportunity to fill out the survey at home. And after that then I followed up with a text message just as a reminder, and 4 weeks after I followed up with a telephone call, and any surveys that we hadn't got back in the post I completed them over the phone. In total, I had 315 responses, and those were all coded and analysed through SPSS. and the statistical tests complete were one-way ANOVAs, so they were analysis of variance and a chi-square test of independence. So just to give you a very high-level overview of the farmer profile, what we found was 65% of our respondents were actually employing people on their farm. They were on average age of 52 years, which is in line with the CSO records. And also 98% of them were male, and they owned their own farm, and they were working on average 69 hours per week. So I suppose, what does that actually mean? If you look here at the table, you'll see NFE on top. So they're non-farm employers. So that's just a one-person operation farm. And then FE3 is farmers employing 3 or more people. And as we can see here, the farmers with 3 or more people are, on average, they're younger. They work less hours per week. They have more weekends off per year. They have more holidays per year. And as to be expected, obviously, they would have a greater herd size. And from speaking to the farmers on the phone, recruitment was one of the biggest issues that they faced. As we can see here from the results, farmers with 2 or more employees use word of mouth most, and farmers with just 1 employee were highly dependent on family members as their only recruitment method. And then in terms of legal practices, so I suppose this is a very serious area and probably an area where farmers can get themselves into most trouble. As you can see here, farmers with 3 or more employees are far better at implementing the legal HRM practices. So that's issuing pay slips, retaining a copy of those, recording the time worked by their employees, and issuing employment contracts. So just to summarise what we actually found from this study, so we established the HRM practices used on dairy farms. We found that farmers with 3 or more employees are significantly better at implementing HRM practices and complying with employment law. We also discovered that farmers should look at adopting HRM practices that will make their workplace more attractive. So at a bare minimum, that means complying with employment law, providing training opportunities for their employees, and creating, I suppose, a learning environment so that their employees can learn and develop. And finally, I suppose further research is actually required on the long-term HRM strategies that farmers implement and on the employment relationships that those HRM practices impact on. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Our fourth presentation is by Conor Hogan, and his study looks at understanding the use of labour on Irish dairy farms.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Conor Hogan, and today I'm going to present the first paper of my PhD, which was an examination of labour time use in spring calf and dairy farms in Ireland. So to give a bit of context, then, as we all know, herd sizes have increased dramatically since 2015 when milk quotas were abolished. While there's also a seasonality challenge associated with pasture-based systems with a large number of cows calving in a compact period. This was summed up by Justine Demon's research previously, which showed that 57% of all workload occurred in the spring and summer seasons, and a third of all workload was in the springtime. As a result, then, it's critical to identify an approach which can improve the seasonal workload and labour demand issues on dairy farms. So previous work has taken place looking to measure labour input. Within Ireland, Kevin O'Donovan firstly measured labour input, but this work was undertaken when milk quotas were in place, so the environment is totally different now compared with then, while Justine Demon's research more recently focused specifically on labour efficient farms. Internationally, then, 2 studies have taken place in New Zealand, which was carried out on larger scale farms which wouldn't be relevant to the Irish scenario, and in the UK, where infrequent data recording and inconsistent recording methods were used during the studies. So then, to look at the materials and methods, so how will we plan on going about this study? So firstly, we plan to measure labour input from January to June 2019, collecting data in real time once a week on an alternate day each week. Farmers will be selected for the study based on having a proportional sample of farmers that, based on the location of cows within herd size categories firstly, and then within regions around Ireland. farms also had to be predominantly spring calving and have access to a smartphone then to use the app on the phone, which we would measure labour input with. So there was 10 tasks on this app, which works similar to a stopwatch function on the phone, and it was used by all farmers and any staff or family members with smartphone access that were working on the farm. Farmers also completed a weekly online survey to capture any labour input not using the app, contractor hours and other livestock details. So advisors were then asked to nominate farmers, and of over 130 farmers nominated, 87 agreed to take part and 82 farmers completed the study. So then to look at the results of the study, so firstly looking at the blue line total farm hours. So as expected, as herd size category increased, total farm hours input increased also. There were significant differences here between all herd size categories apart from the 50 to 90 and 90 to 140 cow categories. There was large ranges in time input within herd size categories, which was one of the main findings. While to look at then on an hours per cow basis, which is the red line, which is how labour efficiency is normally measured. So there is an economies of scale effect similar to previous research, with significant differences between all herd size categories apart from the 140 to 240 and 240 plus category this time. But the main point I'd be taking away from this slide is the large ranges in labour efficiency within herd size categories. These ranges were particularly clear in the smaller herd size categories, decreasing as herd size category increased. While this shows the large scope for improvement there is on farms for labour efficiency, it also shows that farms within each herd size category are capable of achieving high levels of labour efficiency, which is important and good to see going forward. So then to look at the overall average, which was 19.2 hours per cow for the 23-week study period for the average herd size of 137 cows. So then to look at the percentage of time devoted to each task. So milking, as expected, was the most time-consuming task, with almost a third of all time, similar to previous research. And this is followed by calf care, which consumed a large amount of time, particularly in February and March, and 4 other main tasks consuming between 9 and 11%, followed by the 3 smaller tasks consuming between 3 and 4% of all time. So just to conclude then, so the ranges of labour input within herd size categories were large. So while this shows that there's large scope for improvement in labour efficiency on farms, it also shows that herd size doesn't impede farmers from becoming more labour efficient. With milking being the most time consuming task, this should be the first point of focus for farmers going forward to improve their labour efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you, Conor. Our fifth presentation of this session is by Maeve Dorr, and her study looks at excess dairy calves, understanding and improving pathways.
My research is titled An Investigation into the Pathways for Non-Replacement Dairy Calves and the Attitude of Stakeholders in the Supply Chain in the Limerick area. The exploratory approach aimed to gain a deeper understanding at farm and industry level of the issues surrounding calf outlets. For my placements in West Cork and in Limerick, I was involved with discussion groups with beef and dairy farmers. Their main concern was finding suitable and accessible outlets for their calves. The issue of dairy calf pathways is both a challenge and an opportunity for Irish agriculture. This is an industry-wide problem. The pathways for non-replacement dairy calves involved many stakeholders. The main routes that were identified were live exports, mart sales, farm sales, and calf slaughter. Participants were intentionally selected to include farmers and stakeholders with experience of these routes. The first stage of data collection involved a focus group with advisors from the Limerick region. The aim of this stage was to identify advisory needs and to help develop interview guides. Next, farmers were interviewed to examine decision-making specific to calf outlets at farm level. The final stage of data collection involved interviewing industry and extension stakeholders to gain their expert perspective on pathways and challenges facing calf markets. Data on farmer decision-making was analysed using the RESET model. Data on calf pathways was analysed and presented as a SWOT analysis. The key findings are broken down into farmer decision-making, stakeholder insights and role of extension. Going into the study, the hypothesis was that farmers preferred one route. However, the interviews with farmers suggested routes were matched to calf type. Other criteria included compatibility, ease of use and cost effectiveness. Good animal welfare was paramount to being considered a good farmer, and this reflects its importance to farmers' goals and values. Concern over public perception was a common theme throughout the stakeholder interviews. Calf slaughter and poor welfare was noted as the biggest threat to Ireland's reputation. The importance of live exports was described as underpinning the market. Ireland's heavy reliance on export was seen as a major weakness. Farm sales were the preferred method due to the low stress impact on calves. A suggested opportunity for marts to facilitate these farm sales as a way to improve their weaknesses from both outlets. Long-term strategies to improve calf markets included improving calf quality through strategic breeding policy, maximising alternative outlets to live exports, and developing a viable beef blueprint to improve domestic outlets. Education is key to changing mindsets. Information campaigns, courses and events can build awareness and can be a source of information. Promoting collaboration within the supply chain could help build trust and transparency, as well as ensuring a unified message across the supply chain. Further research is necessary to improve representation by including a larger sample of the population and more stakeholders. When disseminating alternatives to farmers, the framing of the innovation is vital to uptake. Good animal welfare can be used to promote Irish agriculture and improve the reputation of certain practices. The take-home message here is that there is no silver bullet solution, but a combination of many small changes that can help improve calf outlets.
Thanks, Maeve. And our final presentation for this session is by Damien Holland, and Damien's study looked at dairy farmers' management practices of bull calves.
Hi, my name is Damien Holland, and the title of my research study is an investigation into dairy farmers' attitudes towards management practices of bull calves.
So the objectives of the study are set out as follows. To determine the level of knowledge exchange between advisors and farmers in discussion groups in terms of dealing with bull calves and farmers. To review farmers' attitudes and practices associated with bull calves. To examine farmer and advisor perceptions on the impact of COVID-19 on bull calf management strategies this spring. To identify farmer and advisor perceptions on effective strategies to future-proofing the dairy industry from a calf welfare perspective. And finally, to compare the level of satisfaction between discussion group members and non-discussion group members with regard to management and housing practices. So just to set the scene and the rationale behind the study, dairy industry stakeholders, including farmers, have categorised welfare as a top management issue on dairy farms. Since the abolition of milk quotas in 2015, dairy cow numbers have increased to just over 1.5 million in 2019, a rise of approximately 190,000 dairy cows. The majority of this growth has intensified stock rates from an existing or increasing land base. Given the seasonal nature of the calving season and the dairy industry's dependence on the export market, it is important to engage with both advisors and farmers on the ground to get a feel for what's happening so that adjustments can be made. There has also been a lot of negativity from animal rights activists this year, and customers both at home and abroad have become more aware of sustainability credentials of the food they consume, highlighting the need to maintain best practice with regard to bull calf management. To address the objectives of the study, two separate questionnaires were designed, one for the farmer and one for the advisor. The farmer questionnaires were primarily conducted over the phone, which I found is very constructive, while the advisor questionnaires were completed through email. Out of the 60 dairy farmers that were selected for the study, 53 participated, giving a response rate of 88%. And 8 out of 11 dairy advisors were involved, giving a response rate of 73%. So moving on to the key findings of the study. It was revealed that there are very proactive and engaging discussion between farmers and advisors in discussion groups in relation to rearing bull calves, as illustrated by the quotation on the left-hand side. The responses were broken down into 5 different categories, and the 2 most popular subjects discussed were market outlets and management practices. One of the interesting findings from the study was that 75% of farm participants claimed that they had sufficient housing capacity at peak demand, once there was no difficulty with markets or health concerns with the bull calves. It was found that 57% of farms managed the bull calves separately to the female calves. The reason cited by the farmers was from a convenience point of view, as the bull calves were going to be sold, and also due to the fact that high SSE and antibiotic milk was commonly given to the bull calves. In relation to the impact of COVID-19, 43% of farmer participants claimed that the virus had an impact on bull calf management practices this spring. There was difficulty with private buyers travelling outside the restricted kilometres during lockdown. Farmers mentioned that the delay in selling the bull calves forced them to keep them longer. As one advisor mentioned in the middle quotation, labour on some farms could not be employed due to the health concerns of themselves or family members. However, the relaxation in the TB-free movement period afforded farmers the opportunity to keep calves for longer without the need to TB test them. To conclude, the results of the study show that there are potential gains from partaking in the discussion group, as farmers can share ideas and harness knowledge from other farmers. It is evident that farmers need to review current housing facilities and plan for possible legislation of having to keep calves for longer. Another point I want to mention is that COVID-19 proved to be a real eye-opener for some farmers, with additional housing and an increase in labour demand required. Overall, the majority of farmers are adhering to best practice. However, there is always room for improvement. Thanks for listening, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Damien.
Perfect. Welcome back to everyone. So I hope you all enjoyed those 6 very interesting and would have hopefully sparked a lot of questions for you. So I'd like to invite all our panelists to join us now for our live Q&A. So if you could all just turn on your cameras and start, and then I'd like to invite everyone watching to get involved in our discussion today by putting in any questions that they have using the Q&A function at the bottom of their screen. So first of all, as I said, well done to the 6 presentations, 6 presenters. They were excellent presentations, and I think really address the topic that we have on today. So I'm going to start the questions off by asking each of our presenters, what is the one key recommendation that they have from their study starting off with? So I was going to start in the order that the presenters, the presentations are played. So Eamon, what's the one key recommendation from your study?
Okay, so probably one of the main things that I pulled out of the study was, I suppose, where dairy farmers are employing staff, the importance of having set starting in times to the day. Okay, so I suppose from an employee's point of view, they're able to plan the rest of the day around this thing. Okay, so it's very important for them, and I suppose from a dairy farmer's perspective, one thing that's going to affect, I suppose, the length of the working day is predominantly the start of evening milking. So I suppose on a lot of dairy farmers across the country, milking is often the last task carried out in the day. So the later that has started, the longer the working day is going to be for the employee. So that's just one of the important things that I pulled from the study.
Perfect, thanks, Eamon. So basically, summarising, you're saying that having a set working hours, and that's generally dictated then by the evening milking. So having a set evening milking, the most important things a dairy farmer can do.
That's it, yeah. And what can't be done on one day can be done the next day. So
that's it. I suppose the key thing is if someone's not going to die or you're not going to lose millions, then it can be later the next day. Perfect, thanks, Eamon. So Niamh.
Hi Marion, thanks very much. Yeah, I suppose just to say my key recommendation from my study would be to try and increase the knowledge among farmers around employment law legislation. Like it's very clear at the minute there's a lack of knowledge maybe among farmers, and they're not aware of the implications of non-compliance fully. So We see that at the minute farmers, they're kind of sourcing a lot of their knowledge from solicitors or from agri accountants, and they're not actually dealing with HR specialists. I think we only saw 8% of respondents in my survey. They actually got their information from agri specialists, agri law specialists. So the key recommendation from my study would be to try and increase farmers' knowledge around the consequences of non-compliance in employment law.
Perfect. So thanks, Niamh. So I suppose, again, to summarise, it's just about increasing the knowledge, I suppose, about from all the industry stakeholders, from farmers to advisors to accountants, etc.
That's it. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Tom, on to you. What's your one key recommendation from your study?
I suppose the one key recommendation I'd have is, I suppose we can see farmers are trying to improve their HRM practices, and I suppose further improvement is probably required across all areas of HR, and backing up probably what Niamh was saying, particularly in terms of the employment law, because I suppose that's the one area where farmers are more exposed to, I suppose, risk and I suppose legal lawsuits and things like that. So that'd probably be the one area that I would say that needs particular attention.
Perfect. So again, following on nicely from Niamh's stuff, that employment law and I suppose getting those basic things right are incredibly important starting off.
Yeah.
Okay, Conor, what's the one key thing from your study?
Similar to Eamon's point, but for farmers to focus on the milking task as the first focus for improvement. It accounts for almost a third of all time, similar to previous studies, and any improvements to the milking task is going to have the greatest effect on overall farm labour efficiency, and similarly tightening up the day and using the 16-8 milking interval, or as close to possible as that, to shorten the day. And there's also plenty of practices, organisation, and other things that can be done to improve the milking that can be relatively straightforward. So that would be my key point.
Perfect. So that's it, Conor. Then to use the milking, because it's the most time-consuming task on farm, to make any improvements, I suppose, starting off there and looking at using the 18-6 milking interval. So that would be, say, milking at 7 a.m. and as a 3 p.m. And then that would be effectively your end time. Then would be after you finish that evening milking. Is that basically
exactly? Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Conor. Maeve, is there a recommendation from your study?
Yeah, so I suppose the main thing that I came up with was that there is no one solution to help with calf pathways, and that we start looking at the dairy and beef sector as one sector and stop seeing it like they're integrated. Like dairy farmers need the beef farmers to be that outlet for their calves. So I think going forward, it's just that everyone has their role to play within the supply chain, and I suppose to kind of help each other out instead of seeing each other as kind of in different sectors.
Okay, perfect. So Maeve, I'm not sure if it's just me, but your audio seems a bit low, so you might just check that. But if I was to summarise, what you're saying is that we need greater cooperation and greater communication, I suppose, between all stakeholders, be it farmers, advisors, marts, etc., and beef farmers and everyone involved to improve the calf industry.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Maeve. On to you, Damien, finally.
Yeah, so just one of the findings that I found in the study was just the value of discussion groups. Like farmers can learn lessons from other farmers and share ideas, and just from the farmer responses, like they can discuss about potential buyers in the area or look and source and labour in the actual area that they're working. So I think that every farmer should be participating in a discussion group. Like they get huge value from it.
Perfect. Thanks, Damien. So that's so basically, don't underestimate the value of being involved in a good group to improve calf welfare.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So there's some questions coming in. So the first question, Niamh, is for you. So what are the key farmer attitude changes needed to make dairy and dry stock businesses the employer of choice? And I suppose, Tom, that might be a relevant question that might bring you in afterwards, but first to you, Niamh.
Yeah, but look, just to, I suppose, overall for the employer to improve their literacy in respect to like documentation and what they have to offer for the employee coming in. If they have if they have some sort of process in place where the employee comes in and they're given their documents, there might be some sort of training programs that will be part of it to try and encourage the employee to stay on farm, I suppose, and to be encouraged to stay there long term. And it's actually a quote from Ford HR, which was a very prevalent one and just kind of stood out to me. It's that employment is the start of a relationship, and it's a relationship that has to be built and maintained over a course of time. So it's not that a farmer can just take on an employee and that's the box ticked, that's complete. It's kind of a life cycle, and you have to have the supports in place, which a service, maybe if you're not au fait or up to date in the area, that you have a service provider that can help you along the way. And if you have trouble, that you can call them and call on expertise, knowledge, not just calling your neighbour or filling in the gaps where you're not sure. So I suppose it's just to try and create a professional environment for the employee to come into where they can continue their knowledge and hopefully have a successful career pathway there. So
perfect, thanks, Niamh. And there's a follow-on question, and Tom, this is directed for yourself as well. First of all, everyone, I suppose, on their excellent presentations, but I suppose, what are your thoughts on casual labour and employment contracts for the same? So Niamh, I'll just start, since we're talking to you, I'll keep with you first, and then Tom, I'll come to you then next. So thoughts on employment contracts for casual labour?
Yeah, look, another key finding, I suppose, from speaking to Ford HR and Jerome, is that casual or seasonal part-time employees, they actually are afforded the same rights as a full-time employee when it comes to legislation. So it's very important that they have their documentation in place. And just because you're in peak time and you take on your neighbour working for a 6-month period down the road or 6 weeks doesn't mean that you don't have to have a contract in place. It's actually very important to do so. And even in my role within IFA, we've seen stories about this where they've brought in casual workers and it's ended in disaster and ended in tears because there was an event on a farm and they're not actually covered. So look, my views on that, it's very important to have the documentation in place and to look to seek advice if you don't have documents like that on farm.
Perfect. Thanks, Niamh. Tom, do you have any further comments to add to that?
Yeah, totally. I would agree with what Niamh was saying, and I suppose from the employee's perspective as well, having the contract of employment in place and having proof of earnings obviously makes their life a bit easier as well if they're obviously looking for a loan or things like that, or even with the taxman, I suppose, they're able to prove their earnings and justify what they've earned.
Yeah, I think it shows just a basic level of respect that if you have these, employment contracts as the basic things in place, even for casual labour, it's going to show you off as a person who's going to be a good employer, and you'll automatically, I suppose, attract more people in. The next question is coming up for you, Eamon. So the question is, are there any social barriers to dry stock farmers taking up employment with dairy farmers? So would it be a loss of face that they cannot make an adequate living from farmers themselves?
Well, I suppose there were, I suppose, a lot of perceptions from dry stock farmers' point of view, I suppose, towards the barriers for dairy farm employment. And I suppose there was a lot of attitudes from both sides as well. So, and a lot of the part-time or the dry stock farmers I spoke to kind of just rejected the idea totally. That there was kind of a kind of divide between dry stock and dairy farmers across the country. So that was definitely one of the barriers towards employment. So there, and what could be done about that, I suppose, then really is touching back on kind of, I suppose, Tom's point there of you becoming using the social skills as well, I suppose, to employ people. So we touched there of how we can make dairy farmers the employer of choice. I suppose one thing I'd like to talk about there is, I suppose, there's perception that employees are totally motivated by salary and wages. So, and there's a lot of research to suggest this is not the case. So I suppose it's important for dairy farmers when they are going employing staff that they're creating work environments that are I suppose places that are appealing to employees' intrinsic motivational factors so you're empowering the employee, you're letting them make their own decisions to a certain degree, you're creating an environment which is, I suppose, which is giving them a good work-life balance, and just you're showing appreciation of work done. So that is, whether it be just a young person coming out, or whether it be you're employing a dry staff farmer. These are very important things as well. So I suppose these are things that dairy farmers can work on, that can break down these barriers that are kind of preventing a lot of dry staff farmers from even thinking about taking up work on dairy farms, which seems to be the case across the country.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Eamon. And I suppose you touched on it there about creating environment and creating that's, inducive to attracting employees. And I suppose one of the key things that we would have seen keep coming up is animal welfare and making sure that, the stock are treated well and having adequate facilities for them. So I suppose that leads on, Maeve, there's a question coming in for you, wondering about how the reset method was being.
So the reset model in my thesis was used as conceptual framework to try and develop the interview guides for when I was speaking to farmers. I felt that in terms of when I was looking at my lit review, and I came across, I suppose, the usual things are the theory, plan, behaviour, and reason, action, and theories like that. But I just found that the reset model had very practical application, and I felt that by using it, there might be a chance that would say, like, overall, everyone's thesis, they want it to be used within the advisory, that they wanted to try and better advisory needs and things like that. So I suppose I was hoping that by using it, that it could then be used to implement change and things like that, because it is used for reset. Reset is for the changing mindsets. So I suppose that is realistically what we need to do within the industry when it comes to calf pathways. Like I said earlier about changing mindsets about the beef and dairy industries as being separate and things like that. So I suppose it was used mainly in the analysis and the development of the interview guides for the interviews.
Perfect. Thanks, Maeve. And so next question is a follow-on one for you, Damien. So were there specific calf management practices that large herds implemented to successfully manage bull calves?
Yeah, well, I didn't really look at herd size and differences between herd size, but just from looking at calf management practices, one thing I noticed that there was only 6% of the herds were using automatic calf feeders, so there is potential there for dairy farmers to increase the uptake of this. And I also found that there was a huge range in the labour input on farms. And one of the things that was mentioned by farmers was trust. They found it hard to trust employing other people, I suppose. Because one farmer actually said that he gets paranoid at night and he just can't trust anyone, so he takes full responsibility himself. So, yeah, that was it.
It's certainly a challenge, and I suppose hopefully maybe that's what we can learn from today's presentation as to how to better support those farmers who need to, I suppose, take a step back and hand some control over to other farmers. So thanks, Damien, for that. Conor, there's a question after coming in for you. The person is wondering, are there different causes to the large variation in hours per cow at each of the different herd size categories?
So I suppose looking at the ranges of hours per cow, like there's a number of reasons for it, and trying to pinpoint them is I suppose one of my next goals. But like you're looking at your facilities, your practices, technologies, work organisation, and even the overall mindset of the farmer. And I suppose preliminary results of looking at the practices have shown that implementing best practices for labour efficiency are having significant impacts on these ranges in labour efficiency. So by implementing the practices, it's shown that these farmers are more efficient. So that's definitely one way to look at it going forward.
And what kind of examples, Conor, when you talk about best practice for labour efficiency, what kind of practices are you thinking? Is there ones in terms of, like, you mentioned about milking being the biggest consumption of time, but is there ones for milking and calf rearing that maybe stick out for you that will improve efficiency?
Once a day milking, early lactation, would be a big one that was linked with the most efficient farms. The technologies for milking also, the ACRs, dump line, auto wash, all of them technologies. Then looking at robotic feeders for calf care and contractor for using the contractor for grassland management. That was a big one, especially in the springtime, and making the most of that. They were the main ones for the main tasks, I suppose.
Perfect. Thanks, Connor. Maeve, I have another question for you. You mentioned about framing innovation was important to get farmers on board. Can you elaborate more on this point?
Yeah, so I suppose from chatting to farmers during the interviews, it came, and like within the literature as well, the framing effect was mentioned regularly. So I suppose the way it kind of talks is in normally when we are disseminating new innovations and like that to farmers, we speak very highly of the scientific merit, but there are a lot of times when farmers, they can't really, they find that very hard to kind of to apply to their own farms. So what I mentioned in the video was the ease of use, compatibility with systems, and cost effectiveness. Those were the three things that came up regularly. I suppose to think about this would be that when you're talking about innovations and new alternatives out there, that you make it in a way that farmers can see it happening on their own farm, because a lot of times you'll hear farmers saying, oh sure, I'm only a small farmer at home, or I'm not a research farm, something like this, that they don't see it within their reach. So it's just to make sure that what we're saying are the benefits and the advantages of the innovations are very much practical measures that farmers understand and that they would use in their own factoring when they're making decisions.
Perfect, thanks, Maeve. So there's a broad question after coming in, and I think I'm going to direct it, I suppose, to Tom and to Niamh initially. Anyway, it's, you know, farmers don't know what they don't know. So how would you go about getting farmers interested in understanding the repercussions and consequences of not improving their HR knowledge? So Niamh, I might ask you first.
Yeah, Marion, look, that's a question that we're trying to debate within IFA at the minute as well, is how to get the message out there. And suppose what we're doing at the minute is actively engaging with commodity meetings. So I'm going to meetings and have a presentation on HR and the consequences of poor employment law management. And look, just instilling some information in the farmers, and if to start at the bottom. So to start just getting the message out there among farmers, the message will travel. So it's just about attending meetings, trying to make stakeholders aware and get the message out there. And then gradually, I suppose, we'll get to a point where farmers are aware, and to be more of an uptake in the service then to improve this.
Thanks, Niamh. Tom, do you have anything else to add in there?
Yeah, I suppose like any farmer, they like to see evidence, and I think if you can show them the benefits of implementing correct HRM practices, like I know from Connor's study, when he was able to show them where they were efficient, where they weren't efficient, if we could do something similar maybe with HR, look, these are the benefits, and if you don't do it, well, look, this is the downside, then you might get more farmers to buy in and get on board with it.
Perfect. And do you think maybe this is a role for, I suppose, discussion groups and advisors, is to bring it to their groups and kind of intermingle them in with, I suppose, the popular topics we would have seen earlier on today that farmers really like learning about, I suppose, grassland management and reading about those topics? Is that a way of, I suppose, increasing knowledge, you think, Niamh and Tom?
Yeah, definitely. I think like the issue of labour and people management needs to be on the same level as all those important areas of running a dairy farm as well, because it's probably one of the most serious issues that they're facing now. Yeah,
I agree, Marion. Look, I suppose farmers in general are becoming more commercialised, and with more commercialised farmers, there's more labour required on farming units. So look, it's a matter of getting the message out there and using every avenue we can to try and get the message across.
Perfect, thanks, Niamh. And we're going to have to draw the session to a close soon, but and there's a good few questions coming in, so we'll hopefully try and get through as many of them as we can. But the next one is for you, Connor. So how happy were you with the app for measuring time for each task?
We were happy with how the app went. Basically, Justine Deming, she did the previous work in this area, and she measured using an app on the phone also, and she had 29 tasks, and I suppose we looked at refining it from that to make the app more user-friendly for farmers. And the knock-on effect was farmers themselves were positive about using it, and their feedback was good, that they were happy using the app, and we could see from the data that it was that it was generally always clean and good to go.
Yeah, and I suppose I think looking at previous studies as well, your results would kind of tie in terms of those other studies that found the breakdown of time spent at those particular tasks. So I suppose that would kind of, indicate perhaps that the app is accurate enough.
Exactly, yeah, that's true too.
Yeah. Perfect. Eamon, there's one other question coming in, and I'll go to you first and see what your thoughts on this, or if you've any opinions from your studies, is what resources are available in the line of advisory services in terms of HR management for farmers, or have you looked at any of that in your study?
Well, I didn't really look at that specifically now in my study, but there is things available. So I suppose Teagasc would have run people and management workshops for farmers in conjunction with the co-ops. So there's that available for farmers, but I suppose it is something that is going to be needed more work in the future, especially with, I suppose, more farmers starting to employ staff. So after the expansion of quotas. So I suppose employing staff on farm is a new thing for a lot of farmers. So it is a slow learning process. So I suppose this is definitely something for the advisory service to target down the road.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and I suppose there is the Teagasc HR people manual there as well for farmers, for employing farmers. That would be very useful, I suppose, for any advisors there. So unfortunately, it's time for me to bring this session to a close. So before I say a few thank yous, I'd like to remind you that the next session on better communication on environmental sustainability is starting at 2 p.m. And you'll find the link for that on the abstract, or the details for the conference itself. So finally, I'd like to thank the presenters today for their excellent presentations and fantastic discussion. Tomas for helping me in terms of chairing the session, and I suppose for you participating in terms of questions and getting the discussion going. So I found it incredibly interesting and informative, and I hope you found the same, and hopefully you'll join us again at 2 p.m. for our next session. Thank you very much.